Marcus told me I was a drag on innovation as he pushed my severance papers across the desk, casually announcing he'd be withholding 4 months of my earned compensation because the budget just won't allow it. I sat there, frozen in that mix of humiliation and disbelief. Americans know all too well when someone in power decides your worth for you. What he didn't realize was that his decision triggered something he never bothered to understand. Something buried in a contract he signed without reading. If you've ever been dismissed like you didn't matter, stay with me. And if this hits home, subscribe and tell me your story in the comments. The first signs never arrive as explosions. They seep in slowly, the way fog slips across the waterfront in Port Providence before anyone realizes visibility is gone. Working in that old converted cannery, glass walls, exposed beams, ocean air humming through vents, I carried the weight of our logistics backbone on my shoulders without ever announcing it. I didn't need to. The numbers spoke for me. Faster routes, steadier shipments, fewer delays than any year before I arrived. People like to joke that I could smell a bottleneck before the dashboards caught it, but jokes like that never reached Marcus Layton. He came in from some inland conglomerate, convinced he'd been hired to revolutionize a company already running smoother than he realized. From day one, he looked at everything as if it existed to irritate him. The creaking freight elevator, the outdated projectors in the conference rooms, the seasoned staff who didn't bow to jargon. When he walked through the office, it was as though each of us had cost him something personally. I felt it most sharply when he'd skim past my desk, without acknowledging the open dashboards I kept ready for questions he'd never ask. He preferred his own theories, big, dramatic, performative ones that made the board lean forward, but ignored the quiet realities that kept the business alive. The first budget cut he made was to my team. He didn't say it directly, of course. He used polished phrases about operational recalibration and redirecting innovation resources. The translation was simple. He pulled funding from the people who built the system in order to funnel it into a flashy internal project his nephew dreamed up after a college internship. That shift didn't just sting. It told me exactly where I stood. It told all of us. Weeks passed, and every change he made added weight to the air. He'd burst into meetings demanding to know why delivery times weren't even faster, why labor couldn't be cut further, why expenses didn't magically shrink. Every time he spoke, there was a quiver under his voice, as if he was terrified someone would ask him a question he couldn't answer. And yet, despite all that noise, he still relied on the system I'd spent years stabilizing, the one that kept 19 warehouses and a dozen transport partners synchronized down to the minute. He'd show performance slides at executive reviews, my performance slides, and act as if he'd wrestled those numbers out of thin air through force of will. I pretended not to notice his glances whenever someone complimented his operational model, but pretending never made anything easier. That winter, when shipments surged and every mistake could have cost us customers, I stayed late nearly every night, walking the aisles between cubicles, checking terminals, running simulations. The building always felt different after 9 p.m., quieter, heavier, like it exhaled once the last meeting warriors went home. Those nights steadied me. They reminded me why I did the work, even when recognition never came. Yet underneath that calm was a quiet dread I couldn't shake, a faint hum of inevitability. Marcus was circling something he didn't understand, poking at foundations he assumed would hold no matter how recklessly he leaned on them. He'd never asked how the whole system stayed upright. He simply assumed it would. People like him always do until the moment everything shifts. And though I didn't know exactly where the breaking point would hit, I could feel it approaching, as certain as the tide rising against the pier outside our windows. The moment Marcus called me into his office, something in the air tightened, as if the building itself sensed what was coming. His glass-walled corner space overlooked the harbor, but he'd drawn the blinds halfway, letting in just enough gray afternoon light to cast long, slanted shadows across the room. When I stepped inside, he didn't greet me. He didn't even pretend to. He just kept clicking his pen, staring at the documents in front of him like they were props he'd rehearsed with. I sat down because standing felt like handing him a stage. The chair was cold, the kind of cold that reminds you you're not supposed to get comfortable. He finally looked up, and the expression on his face struck me more deeply than the words that followed. It was relief. Relief that he finally got to do whatever he'd been building up to for weeks. "Let's make this simple," he said, voice flat, clipped. "Your position is being retired." Retired, as if it were an old piece of furniture he no longer wanted in the room. Before I could respond, he pushed a folder toward me with 2 fingers, keeping his body angled backward, distancing himself from the fallout. "I need you to sign this acknowledgement today, effective immediately." His tone held that brand of overconfidence unique to men who have never had to doubt themselves. I opened the folder, scanning the termination paperwork. No rationale, no performance review, just a clean surgical cut. "Why now?" I asked, because I needed to hear the lie he'd chosen. Marcus leaned forward as if preparing to deliver a line he'd practiced in the mirror. "Your output the last few months hasn't aligned with our new trajectory. We need more adaptable talent, people who push innovation rather than maintain it." He said, maintain the way someone else might say contaminate. He waited, clearly expecting defensiveness, maybe even tears. But when I stayed silent, his confidence swelled. He tapped the folder again. "We also need to discuss compensation." That's when he delivered the blow with a rehearsed calm that made it even more insulting. "We're postponing disbursement of your severance. Things are tight and finance can't release anything until end of quarter. Same for the accrued comp time you've banked. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality of the business." 4 months of earned time, hours I'd accumulated covering holiday shortages, coordinating emergency reroutes, stabilizing peak season chaos. He dismissed them like loose coins on a counter. I didn't speak because speaking would have revealed too much. Marcus misread my silence as surrender. "Look, Rosemary," he said, softening his voice into something he must have thought sounded empathetic. "This is the nature of restructuring. You've worked hard. No one is denying that. But the company needs a different kind of energy now." The irony hit like a dull thud. He was firing the one person keeping his precious metrics afloat, while praising himself for recognizing future needs. He continued rambling about streamlining, redefining roles, building leaner teams. None of it mattered. His eyes told the truth. He didn't value what he didn't understand. And he'd convinced himself that understanding wasn't necessary for authority. "We'll have security walk you out," he added, sliding his chair back, already moving to end the conversation. "It's standard procedure. You understand." The phrase lodged itself under my skin, not the meaning, but the assumption. He didn't ask if I understood. He assumed I would obey. In his mind, this chapter ended with me quietly disappearing and him congratulating himself on decisive leadership. He stood, adjusting his blazer as if preparing for a photo, and I realized how small he looked when stripped of performance. I closed the folder and rose without shaking his hand, without giving him the satisfaction of a question, an objection, or a hint of the storm he'd just walked into. His confidence flickered then, just briefly, a microsecond of uncertainty he tried to hide. He expected outrage, or pleading, or maybe gratitude for how professionally he delivered the blow. What he didn't expect was composure. And he certainly didn't expect that the moment he withheld what I'd earned, he crossed into territory he couldn't navigate. Territory where his authority meant nothing, and my silence was not weakness but preparation. The walk back to my desk felt strangely weightless, as if my body were moving ahead of my mind and dragging my thoughts behind like a loose thread. People looked up from their monitors when I passed, but no one asked anything. Maybe they sensed it. Maybe the shift in the air had reached them too. My workspace sat tucked between a window facing the pier and a column of old timber left over from when the building processed fish instead of freight data. I had always liked that contrast, modern workflows built on weathered beams, but now it felt like a reminder of how easily history is repurposed when someone decides it's no longer useful. I opened my bottom drawer and pulled out the folder I had kept there since the day I signed my employment agreement. It wasn't sentimentality that made me keep it close. It was foresight, the kind born from years of watching talented people discarded without warning. I had promised myself I'd never be caught unprepared, not in a company where leadership turnover was practically seasonal. The folder felt heavier than I remembered as I carried it out of the office, with the security escort trailing politely behind. Outside, the wind carried the briny smell of the harbor, sharp enough to clear the fog of the past hour. I sat in my car, shut the door, and finally let the silence seal around me. Only then did I open the folder. The pages were familiar, but reading them now was like hearing my own voice echo back from another time, a version of me who knew exactly what protections I needed long before Marcus arrived. Clause 9.4 wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was a small entry buried deep in the agreement, written in plain language because I insisted on clarity. Years ago, I had learned that the most dangerous traps in a contract aren't the complicated ones. They're the ones shrouded in ambiguity. So I built my safeguard with precision. All rights granted to the company existed only if my compensation was delivered fully and on time. Any delay, reduction, or withholding meant their rights to use my work expired immediately. Not gradually, not pending review, immediately. And the moment Marcus denied my severance and 4 months of earned comp time, he triggered the expiration without realizing it. The company didn't own the framework I built. They used it under conditional access, and that condition had just been violated. I traced the paragraph with my fingertip, not out of doubt, but to anchor myself to the reality I was about to step into. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was enforcement. A boundary set long before emotions entered the picture. The legal architecture was simple. Once access expired, only the system's primary key holder, me, could authorize or renew permissions. And without that renewal, every operational component relying on synchronization, tracking, and shipment timing would eventually drift out of alignment. The collapse wouldn't be immediate, but it would be unavoidable. Marcus thought he'd ended something in that office. He had no idea he'd only started a countdown he couldn't stop. I closed the folder and held it, for a long moment, letting the truth settle through me like steady ground returning after a long tremor. This wasn't the ending he thought it was. It wasn't the ending I would accept. Somewhere inside that realization, fear loosened its hold on me, and something sharper took its place: clarity. He'd taken what I earned. Now the conditions he ignored were going to take everything he relied on. I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I sat in the parking lot, watching the warehouse lights flicker on one by one as evening settled over the harbor. Forklifts beeped in the distance, gulls circled overhead, and the whole place throbbed with a rhythm I had come to know intimately. For years, every movement on that dock had depended on systems I shaped line by line, rule by rule, adjustment by adjustment. And now, the very access that kept those gears spinning rested on a condition Marcus had shattered without a second thought. I took out my laptop, not with anger or desperation, but with an unsettling calm I hadn't expected. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't fear. It was the kind of stillness that arrives when you know the next step is unavoidable, the kind of clarity that feels less like a choice and more like gravity. When I logged into my dashboard, the interface greeted me like an old friend. Familiar, steady, waiting. Everything was functioning, but only because the expiration window had just begun ticking. The system was built to run smoothly for a short time, even after losing authorization. No one would notice the shift immediately. Not yet. But drift was inevitable. Without my renewal, synchronization between hubs would falter, packages would backlog, routes would desync, communication nodes would start timing out. Small cracks first, hairline fractures invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look, then the widening gaps that force everything else to collapse around them. I issued the formal notice next, the one Clause 9.4 required. It was brief, precise, stripped of emotion. Notification of breach, immediate expiration of access rights, failure to compensate as contracted. I attached the signed agreement and sent copies to Marcus, HR, and the company's compliance inbox. The timestamp glowed on the screen like a lit fuse. Afterward, I simply sat and breathed, letting the weight of the moment settle. It wasn't revenge I felt, it was inevitability. You don't remove the keystone from an arch and expect the structure to remain standing. You don't violate the one condition your entire operation depends on and expect the foundation to forgive you. I closed my laptop and drove away, the harbor shrinking in my rearview mirror until the buildings became nothing more than a jagged silhouette against the fading sky. At home, the quiet felt sharper than usual, almost electric. I poured a glass of water and set it on the counter, gripping the edges to steady myself. I had followed the contract. I had taken the step it empowered me to take. Now I had to wait. The first call came an hour later, an unknown number. I didn't answer. The second call followed minutes after, then a third, then 5 more in rapid succession. The vibration of my phone against the table grew so constant, it sounded like a trapped insect begging for release. I muted it and walked into the living room. The glow of the streetlights filtered through the curtains as I sat on the edge of the couch, trying to anchor myself. What I felt wasn't guilt or vindication, it was something closer to solemn anticipation. I had lived long enough in the corporate world to know exactly how quickly chaos spreads when the wrong domino falls. I didn't have to imagine what was happening in the office. I could picture it perfectly. First, the quiet confusion when order confirmations failed to sync. Then the tech lead tapping keys harder than necessary, convinced it was a temporary glitch. Then calls from warehouse supervisors asking why label printers were kicking out corrupted tags. And somewhere in that frantic escalation, Marcus pacing the hallway, snapping orders, blaming the nearest person, refusing to believe the problem could be anything more than a temporary inconvenience. But software built on violated terms doesn't break with drama. It decays with precision. And every decaying system eventually reaches its breaking point. The messages turned from missed calls to emails, the subject lines shifting from update needed to urgent issue to critical failure. By the time I finally glanced at the notifications piling up on my screen, the tone had changed entirely. They weren't asking for updates anymore, they were asking for me. I closed the phone again and let the darkness settle, knowing the night was just beginning for them. By morning, the consequences had matured into full-grown crisis. I woke to the sound of someone pounding on my apartment door, each hit vibrating through the wood like a warning drum. For a moment, still half asleep, I wondered if the storm had finally reached me physically. When I peered through the peephole and saw Marcus standing there, hair disheveled, collar twisted, desperation clinging to him like sweat, I understood the night had not been kind to him. I didn't open the door. Instead, I walked to the kitchen and let the coffee machine hum to life while he continued knocking, calling my name with a voice stripped of authority. He'd never said my name with that tone before. Not urgent, not pleading. Eventually, the knocking faded, replaced by muffled conversation as he stepped away to make a call. I heard fragments through the door. She has to... No, she isn't. Yes, everything's down. No, I didn't... His sentences crumbled into frustration before dissolving into footsteps retreating down the hall. Only after he left did I turn my phone on. It lit up instantly, vibrating so intensely it nearly slid across the counter. 37 missed. Calls. Dozens of messages. The most recent ones were from people who hadn't spoken to me in months. Directors, supervisors, partners. Their words climbed in intensity, from polite requests to urgent demands to frantic confessions of how bad things had become overnight. I should have felt something sharp, maybe satisfaction or anger finally released, but instead I felt a cool detachment, as if I were watching the aftermath through thick glass. It wasn't distance, it was clarity. They weren't calling because they valued me. They were calling because they finally understood the void my absence left behind. When my phone rang again, Marcus's name lit the screen. This time, I answered. His breath hitched before he spoke, like he'd been running. "Rosemary," he said, skipping any greeting. "You need to come back. The system is failing. Warehouses can't print manifests. Trucks can't depart. The order queue is jammed." He kept going, stacking problem on problem, hoping the gravity would pull me in. I let him continue until he finally paused for air. "You violated my contract," I said evenly. "Access expired when you withheld my compensation." He tried to laugh, but it cracked halfway. "Expired?" "Rosemary, be reasonable. This isn't the time to argue semantics. People's jobs are on the line. Customers are threatening to sue. Our largest distributor walked out of negotiations this morning. You should have thought about that yesterday, I replied. He exhaled sharply, frustration bleeding into fear. Fine, then tell me what you want. Money? A higher role? A new contract? I'll give you anything if you fix this. The sudden submission in his voice might have stunned me once, but now it rang hollow. He wasn't apologizing. He was bargaining with a foundation he'd already broken. No, I said. What I want is not something you can offer. Silence expanded on the line before he whispered, You're going to let everything fall apart? It fell apart when you decided what I earned wasn't worth paying, I said. Actions have consequences, Marcus. You set them in motion. He inhaled shakily, and for the first time, I heard the truth beneath his words. He wasn't afraid of losing the company. He was afraid of being held responsible for it. That fear had weight, and it was finally resting where it belonged. I ended the call before he could continue. The quiet that followed wasn't victory and wasn't regret. It was something steadier, something earned, the sound of a balance shifting back into place. After the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table, letting the silence settle into something sturdier than relief. The chaos consuming the company no longer felt like my burden to shoulder. For the first time in years, my future wasn't tethered to someone else's approval or budget cuts disguised as strategy. What remained was possibility, raw, unfamiliar, and quietly thrilling. I opened my laptop, not to check messages or monitor the unraveling system, but to revisit an idea I'd tucked away month after month whenever exhaustion or self-doubt crept in. It was a sketch of a consulting venture, nothing elaborate, just notes about gaps in the maritime logistics market, inefficiencies I'd seen repeatedly, and solutions I knew could redefine the way mid-sized distributors operated. I had always pushed the thought aside, reminding myself I didn't have time or resources or the audacity to chase something of my own. Yet now, in the wake of losing the job that had consumed so much of my life, the idea no longer felt distant. It felt overdue. I spent the rest of the morning drafting a framework. Not technical blueprints, but a vision. How I would structure partnerships, how I could adapt my expertise into something portable and powerful, how I might pitch my approach without leaning on corporate jargon that drained meaning from real impact. The more I wrote, the more I realized I wasn't building something new. I was reclaiming something I'd quietly built all along. The next day, I registered an LLC. Seeing my name attached to a business, my business, sent a current through me stronger than any performance review Marcus had ever dismissed. I created a simple website with clear language and real numbers. No flash, no inflated promises, just the truth. I could help companies reduce shipment delays, strengthen inventory accuracy, and optimize routes in ways that saved them millions. I added a small contact form at the bottom and published the site before I could second-guess myself. Then I shared it. Nothing dramatic, just a post in a few industry groups explaining that I was offering independent consulting for maritime and regional distribution firms. Within hours, messages trickled in. At first, I assumed they were the usual courtesy responses, the polite acknowledgments people send when they don't want to leave someone hanging. But these weren't vague compliments. These were inquiries, real ones, from companies describing specific challenges they needed solved. By evening, I had my first potential client call scheduled. The conversation lasted less than half an hour, but it shifted something fundamental inside me. The CEO spoke plainly about their issues, asked direct questions, and listened without dismissing my experience. When she said, "We need someone who understands this work the way you do," I felt a warmth rush through me that had nothing to do with validation. It was recognition. Recognition I hadn't realized I'd been starved of. She didn't hesitate at the proposal I sent. She didn't question the value. She simply said, "Send the contract." I hung up the call and stared at my hands, suddenly aware of how steady they felt. In the days that followed, more inquiries arrived. 2 more meetings, another signed agreement. I found myself filling notebooks with plans, hiring a part-time coordinator, mapping out timelines. It wasn't some meteoric rise. It was deliberate, grounded momentum. Each step forward felt like reclaiming another part of myself I'd once buried under responsibility, fear, or someone else's narrative of what I was allowed to be. And as I built, I understood the quiet truth that had waited years for me to acknowledge it. I hadn't lost a job. I had finally stepped out of the shadow of people who never deserved the work I poured into them. Momentum has a way of revealing truths that had been hiding in plain sight. As my consulting work expanded, I found myself stepping into conference rooms where people didn't see me as an accessory to someone else's authority, but as the person whose insight could reshape their entire operation. Every meeting sharpened something inside me, something long dulled by years of being spoken over, minimized, or treated as a cog that could be swapped out without consequence. I didn't recognize how deeply that treatment had seeped in until the world outside it responded so differently. A month into the business, I secured an office. Nothing grand, just a narrow space on the fourth floor of an old brick building overlooking the marina. The landlord handed me a key and pointed to the frosted glass door already etched with my company's name. Seeing it stopped me mid-step. I touched the lettering gently, half afraid it would vanish if I blinked too fast. That moment didn't erase everything I'd endured, but it reframed it. This wasn't a consolation prize for surviving a toxic environment. It was proof that I'd finally stopped shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never built to hold me. Meanwhile, word spread about what had happened at my former company. I didn't chase the details, but bits of the fallout drifted to me through industry channels. Their logistics gridlock had worsened. Contracts evaporated. Lawsuits emerged. Investors pulled out. In the end, Marcus wasn't just removed. He was publicly scrutinized for negligence, financial mismanagement, and knowingly violating employment terms. One article described him as a leader undone by the one safeguard he failed to read, and I couldn't help feeling the weight of that sentence. Not triumph, not pity, just the strange symmetry of seeing cause and effect align so precisely. I never wished him ruin. I wished him accountability. And accountability, it turns out, is often loud and unforgiving. One afternoon, months after everything unraveled, I passed by a cafe near my office and caught a glimpse of someone who looked like him sitting alone, shoulders curved inward, staring at nothing. For a heartbeat, I wondered what he would say if he saw me. If he'd try again to plead, to justify, to rewrite the past in a way that absolved him. But he didn't look up, and I didn't stop walking. Some chapters don't need revisiting. My own story had grown too full to make space for the wreckage he left behind. Clients called, projects expanded. I hired 2 more people. We celebrated small victories with takeout lunches and whiteboard sketches. Each step felt like laying a stone in a path I was finally choosing for myself, not one I inherited by necessity. On my first Friday in the new office, I brewed a cup of coffee and sat at my desk, listening to the quiet hum of work happening around me. The mug warmed my hands, steady and grounding. There was no drama, no crisis, no one looming over me with demands. Just a door with my name on it and the life I rebuilt behind it. And for the first time in years, I felt the unmistakable fullness of a truth I had earned. No one would ever decide my worth again. Hidden strength is a strange thing. Most people don't recognize it while it's building, least of all the people who underestimate you. When everything with Marcus collapsed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter, something earned. Looking back, the most powerful moment wasn't when the company fell apart or when new clients trusted me with their business. It was when I opened that old folder in my car and realized I had protected myself long before anyone tried to take something from me. That steady preparation, those nights I spent documenting changes, saving contracts, and writing things down that others brushed off, those habits saved me. They didn't look dramatic. They didn't feel heroic. But they held when everything else broke. And that's the part I hope people understand. Quiet strength isn't passive. It's deliberate. It's the choice to stay aware, stay prepared, and stay rooted even when someone in power tries to decide your worth for you. If a friend were sitting across from me right now, coffee in hand, asking what I learned, I'd say this: protect your work even when no one's watching. Keep records even when you think you'll never need them, and never assume leadership will act in your best interest just because they should. Preparation is a form of self-respect, and it's one of the few things in a workplace no one can take from you. How to get started today. Make a personal folder for important documents and agreements. Store it somewhere only you control. Write down major contributions at work, including dates and outcomes. Save every contract and read the parts most people ignore. Keep an email trail for decisions that affect your role or workload. Build small habits that protect your time, your boundaries, and your value. What quiet strength have you been sitting on without realizing its power?